Good afternoon to all of you. My name is Ralf Dierer. I am the Managing Director of the eFuel Alliance, and I will be the chair of today's conference. And of course, I want to answer your questions and pass them on to our different speakers. However, we would like to start with an official welcome, and this will be done by the speaker of the eFuel Alliance, Dr. Monika Griefer, the former Minister of Environment of Lower Saxony and co-founder of Greenpeace Germany. For many years, she has been in politics, and now she's the speaker of the eFuel Alliance. We are very much looking forward to your welcome, Monika. Yes, thank you very much, Ralf. I am also very glad to be here and that we've got so many interested listeners. We see that the topic is becoming still more important, and I'm conducting many talks with many people, and we realized that this is a very current topic. We've got more than 150 member companies and organizations at the eFuel Alliance now. Our latest member is the ADAC with 21 million consumers in the whole of Europe. And our members comprise not only industrial companies along the whole value chain, but also the customers who at the end take important decisions and buy products and of course have to pay for them. Last week, an eFuel Alliance in Austria was launched officially with more than 100 member companies, and a production facility was opened in Graz. In 2030, it is to produce more than 240 million liters. Not only in Brussels, but also in Berlin, the question of e-fuels is being discussed intensively. And also the question of new vehicles. Are there going to be only electric vehicles? Will there be a general ban on internal combustion engines as the EU Commission envisages it for 2035? Is it possible to register CO2 neutral cars after 2025? As the German politicians propose at the moment? And how is this all going to work? Against this controversial background and the political debate, we interfered and we want to present a possible solution, namely how both goals can be reached within the European CO2 fleet regulation. We asked Frontier Economics to take a look at the scientific impact assessment of the EU Commission, particularly with focus on renewable fuels from wind, solar power, and whatever, with CO2, synthetic fuels. This is what is most important. These are fuels that are not produced by nuclear power or any other hazardous powers. For me, as a convinced social democrat and former Minister of the Environment, this is a very important topic. And I come from a large federal state which is characterized by automotive industry. For me, it is important that we do not only have ideological debates, but that we start to act, that we interfere, and that every euro invested into renewable energies is also an asset for climate protection. And synthetic fuels belong to this topic. And whether we will need e-fuels in cars at the end, or whether there will only be electric cars, this is not the most important question. The most important question is that we need a solution for 1.4 billion cars which drive on internal combustion engines worldwide at the moment. And that is why the social component is so important to me, because of course, we can start right away by mixing synthetic fuel into a traditional fuel, because it works just as petrol does. And we can start with lower amounts, and even if the amounts are still little, the price rise at the petrol station will not be too high. And then we can use the economies of scales. We can enlarge our facilities and scale up the amounts and compensate for the higher price, just as we've seen with wind and solar energy. We hope that there will be new cars driving with this option, and therefore we think that this is also a social solution, and it will be also a solution in order to exclude fossil fuels gradually. And that is why we asked to carry out the study that is going to be presented today, and I pass the floor back to Mr. Diemer, who will announce the next speaker. Thank you very much, Monika Griefahn. I think that we've got some technological issues, but I hope this is going to be better briefly. Thank you very much for your welcoming words. And indeed, the eFuel Alliance is growing and thriving, and that is good news. The reason for today's event is the presentation of the accrediting system. And we asked a colleague of Frontier Economics to present this system to us within the topic of the CO2 fleet regulation. They, of course, because since they developed the study, are the ones who want to present it. But before that, we would like to listen to two introductory remarks, one from industry and one from politics. And I would like to welcome Dr. Martin Berger. Martin Berger is in the board of the eFuel Alliance, but he also works as the Vice President of Corporate Research and Advanced Engineering at Mahle International, a large automotive supplier headquartered in Stuttgart. Mr. Berger has a lot of technological know-how. He comes from computer science and electronics, a very interesting background, actually, particularly for the task that he's fulfilling at the moment. And Mahle is a company that is undergoing a transformation from combustion technology, where they are still very strong, and now they try to employ more and more new technologies, and that is, of course, a very interesting task. We are very glad that you are with us. Dr. Berger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diemer. Dear listeners, I'm really happy to be here. And I would like to give you some insights after this short introduction. So please consider this not from the view of my company, but rather from the view of an engineer who has not a background in combustion engines, but is very interested in collecting reason and also doing something for the environment rather than following ideological issues. So this is my first slide. Let's have a look at the energy mix, the way we are using it currently in Europe. And we can say that in Germany, we don't have a huge mix. What you can see here is that more than 2/3, I mean, there are also other charts, but there's around 2/3 is depending on imports, and what we are importing is oil and derivatives and also gas. So all the renewables that we currently have, you usually see two numbers. Usually it's 1/4 and 1/3. And in terms of renewables, what we have in Europe currently, this is true for the self-produced sources. But if you look at the green part, it is not enough. If you consider that we want to have the exit of fossil fuels, and the electric need is growing, we can see that the renewables cannot grow as much as we might need them. And in order not to stop this, we will have to stay an import country and have to just forget about the idea that we can be self-sufficient in Europe or in Germany. How can we do that? And please switch to the next slide. So what we have in mind is to have the technology export in an area where there is more sun and wind than in Europe. If you look at the colors, you can see that in Europe we are in the middle related to the fact or the amount of wind and sun. And you see this color-coded mix, and there are also areas in Asia, also in Northern Africa and in Middle East, there is way more wind and sun available than this is the case in Germany. So this means that we should export technology and then import the renewable energy. And the main message of this overview is the energy that is created somewhere in the world needs to be stored somewhere, and it is not easy to transport electric energy, but it could be transported via synthetic fuels. I don't want to really go into details what synthetic fuels are. Let's just assume that it is something than simple hydrogen and long-chain molecules that helps diesel engines. On the next slide, you can see how the situation is currently from the point of view of Marl and also my personal view. We have different drivetrains that need CO2. If we start from the bottom left, the e-bikes, scooters, subcompact, compact, and of course we can discuss about where the borders are. So this is a bit blurry here, but you can see that this blue area has hydrogen use, and we also included the combustion engine with hydrogen here. What we want to show is where e-fuels can be used. We have also a huge variability, and in order to achieve our CO2 goals, we need to use all the options we have. So this starts from 100% e-mobility, but also from other drivetrains up to hydrogen-oriented or combustion drivetrains, and also with the use of synthetic fuels that I've mentioned before. And I think this is the best way to store energy that we hopefully can use or create from renewable energies. The next slide is what you see here is the global fleet development, where the market is right now. So I didn't include any precise numbers, but I used percentages. If you see where we are starting at the moment, where the combustion engines are, and also where in 2030 we are going to be, we can see that this might be exponential growth, maybe in the green part or the blue one, the light blue one. But you can also recognize that there is also a kind of satiation in this context. And that's why we need to change the system. So this is a very optimistic overview of electric cars in Europe, in China, and in Northern Europe. So we don't have, we didn't include the numbers from Latin America, and we don't have any contributions from threshold countries. So this is a very optimistic outlook up to 2030. So even if all the engines would be electrified, this shows, or even if the vehicles would be electrified, this shows that we need to change something if we want to see a visible effect. So what we see here is a good start up to 2030 to change the fleet for 20%, but this means that we don't have more options. And this is my last slide, could also be something to think of during the discussion. If you consider that we have 175 million battery-driven vehicles, so this is a very vague forecast that might be driven with renewable energies. And then on the other side, we might have synthetic fuels to balance this out, to balance out the 960 combustion engine, 60 million combustion engine. Then we save the same amount of CO2. You see the same amount on the left side and on the right side.
Also, wie gesagt,
So,
bin jetzt nicht derjenige,
as I said, I am not the one who is dreaming of 100% of a mixture of e-fuels, but 20% would already make the same contribution than from 100% renewable energy engines. So I think that this is clear advantage of synthetic fuels for storing energy and for the renewable energy that we will have to produce. And at the same time, it is a wonderful help to avoid CO2 creation. So this was my last slide. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Berger. These were really interesting figures right at the beginning of your presentation. I think considering how we can, or asking ourselves how we can achieve the climate goals and what can we do to do so is very important. And I think in this sometimes in the debate, it is not discussed. And when we talk about the one-fits-all solution and think that we might be able to achieve this goal, I think we have to put it the other way around. Don't exclude anything and consider everything that might be possible. So if you have any questions, this is the time now. Please use the chat box for us. We have 222 participants at the moment. And I would, if there are no direct questions, I would like to continue with the second input that we have. And Mr. Giesecke is here. He is a member of the European Parliament for the CDU or the EVP. And he's from Lower Saxony. And he is in this second mandate and also a member of the Committee on Transport and Tourism. And he's also the shadow of the EPP. And he will also talk about the fleet limitations that is on the agenda. And we are very much looking forward to the situation on the Parliament and where the ideas are going. Jens, please.
Thank you very much, Ralf Diemer and Monika Griefahn and the friends from eFuels for inviting me. I send my greetings directly from the heart of the European legislator, from the European Parliament. I've been asked to give a short impression on the general Fit for 55 package, and then, of course, I will come to the relevant CO2 standards for cars and vans. You know, perhaps I start with just a very simple political statement. We fight climate change and we take the things very seriously, but we want to reduce CO2 and at the same time safeguard our competitiveness and in an idle manner be technology neutral. You all know very well the 13 proposals from 14th of July, and from a humble perspective of a member of the European Parliament, 3,500 pages of legislation. I'm happy to have at least 2 APAs to take care that we read everything carefully. If we come to certain files, we obviously have serious problems with the Commission's proposal, for example, with CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. This is international trade, it's WTO relevant. And if I just recognize that China and US will not be part of this Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, I just have to acknowledge that this will not fly. And so we have to work on alternatives. And it sounds always very easy when the European Commission talks about the Fit for 55 package, but takes the effort sharing file, for example. Everyone agrees to have an ambition of 55%, but no one agrees to real responsibility on the ground. And there we come to really serious problems. But I will not bother you with all the problems of the Fit for 55 package. We have just limited time with 90 minutes. We would need 9 hours. I will come directly to the CO2 file for passenger cars and vans. And some of you might remember I was the shadow rapporteur in the last term with my colleague from Malta, Miriam Dalli. And just to remind you, in 2019, we agreed on 37.5% ambition level for cars to 2030. But now with the raising of ambition, the Commission proposed to have 55% in 2030 and even 0 gram in 2035. And this, of course, has nothing to do with planning security. And it is, even if the Commission states the opposite, it is not technology neutral, it is the opposite. It is a ban of the combustion engine, of the plug-in hybrids. And so we have to see where we can have a better regulation and not a worse regulation. As a member of the EPP group, we always stood for the principle of opportunities, market economy, and technology neutrality. So how to proceed? Because I know very well that you are interested in the details and how we work now. You all know very well that in our procedure in the Parliament, the lead is in the Environmental Committee. It's just up to Transport and ITRE to give opinions. Luckily, I'm a member of both committees as well. But apart from this, the rapporteur is my Dutch colleague, Jan Huytema. And obviously, there is one thing which I have learned. He is, because not just the 200 people today coming to this webinar, the interest is amazing, overwhelming, so that for Jan, there is no chance to have further meetings with lobbyists and people who could explain things. That is, of course, a pity. And I think we should be open to dialogue and to exchange of views. That is very important. Because if I tell you that on the 7th of December, we will have the report to translation, it's not just, it's 1 month. And the first report will be written already. And we have the deadlines of amendments in transport in the Environmental Committee already 25th of January. the vote in NB in April, and the final vote in plenary in May. So this is not a year, it's just 6 months of legislation, and that is a huge challenge. From an EPP perspective, I have some doubts whether the Commission meets with the proposal, the principle of technologically neutrality. So we have to improve the proposal. I think that the 2035 goal with 0 gram is not reachable. It's just a ban of technology. So we should question this date. Perhaps we can go to 2040 or to 2045. And I have learned that recently in Council there are interesting discussions, even from the France representation, and they will have the presidency of the Council next year. From a social point of view, even to do something on plug-in hybrids, perhaps going with e-fuels, which are carbon neutral. So my general message is the EPP is ready to think about a crediting system for e-fuels, because if this is carbon neutral, this should be a possibility. We should not be too one-sided. We should not ban technology. We should be open. We should create opportunity. This will lead to innovation. And this is how we will proceed. But obviously, there are too many experts in this webinar. It is always difficult to reach a majority for such a reasonable position in the Environmental Committee. So I think the final fight will take place in the plenary, and we will vote on those very serious questions in plenary to give a chance. And if you remember the last CO2 regulation, we had very close an incentive for CO2 for e-fuels. It made it just to a recital, but perhaps this time we are successful with such a voluntary crediting scheme for e-fuels. I think it's worth thinking about it. I'm pretty convinced. Perhaps you can go with me this direction to convince other colleagues, because it's just a majority necessary in Parliament, but I count on your support, and then we can really work on better regulation. This is my aim. Thank you for listening.
Ja, Jens Giesecke, vielen herzlichen Dank.
Jens Giesecke, thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you for your very clear statement about your openness to technology. We're very happy about this. Let me ask you one question right away, if I may. We see, and you also mentioned, that the EPP parliamentary group is relatively open, particularly in terms of accrediting system for a CO2 fleet regulation. We will have a discussion, it is already going on, launched by the proposal of the Commission about a ban on internal combustion engines. The Commission proposes that CO2 emissions have to be reduced to 0 by 2035. And according to our today's understanding, this is a plan that is to be reached only with fuel cell vehicles or with electric vehicles. This is a question of banning the internal combustion engine. The question is, do we really want such a ban? Or do we rather support a further development of these engines? Maybe the question could also be whether we want such a ban in 38 or 2040. Others would say that it would be necessary to have such a decision earlier. For example, the German Green Party. What do you think? The crediting system could be a compromise in order to keep up the 100% and at the same time create climate neutral fuels for combustion engines. What do the other parliamentary groups think about that? Could you say some words about that? Yes, we are at the beginning of the process, and of course there are the usual colleagues who don't see any possible solutions. You spoke about the Green Party. They are also represented here in Brussels. They usually say that they want to reach the zero goal already in 2030, but they don't have a majority with this topic. I believe that it's not possible in the Environmental Committee, but maybe in the Parliament to find a majority. However, I have to say that even within the EPP, there are people saying that they want to support a ban on the internal combustion engine, but they are in a minority. And as a German deputy, I also have to look to Berlin. And I find it remarkable and very interesting that in the negotiating paper of the new government, the crediting system for e-fuels is part of this negotiation paper. Let us see whether it will also be part of the coalition treaty, but that would be a good basis for Germany. And then we would have to talk about the question whether we can postpone the time, the deadline for reaching the goal. But it's a good signal from the negotiations in the German parliament. Thank you, Jens. I've got one question from the chat that is rather to the lawyer working at the European Parliament, a question of Mr. Koshravi asked in the chat. Is there a role model for a technology ban on combustion engines? Or in other words, is it possible legally to ban diesel and petrol-driven cars and vans? Is there any experience in the European Parliament? It's quite an interesting question, whether it's really possible to put a ban on technology. Of course, the Commission has made its impact assessments on the economic consequences of such bans. The legal question can be answered by the words that the proposal is there. The Commission thinks that it's possible to implement or to propose such a ban on diesel and petrol-driven cars. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. And the legal service of the EU did not resist. Otherwise, this draft legislation would not have been developed. So it is there, and that means that the Commission thinks that this legal procedure is possible. I think this is doubtful because it's not necessary to implement such a ban if you do other things, alternative, voluntary things. This is not an obstacle to electromobility, but just a further possibility to reduce CO2 emissions. So we should be open to innovation, to competition, and not curtail ourselves. Thank you very much. And now I've got another question that I would also like to ask you of Mr. Markov, who says, you haven't talked about biofuels yet. The eFuel Alliance represents not only synthetic fuels from renewable energies, but also biofuels, particularly those of the last generation. And I think it is clear to all of us that biofuels play a role, but that at the same time, biofuels are limited simply because of the fact that there won't be enough biomass. But the question to the Member of Parliament is, which role do biofuels play, according to your opinion in this question? They are regulated over the Renewable Energies Directive, and we don't want to have a double regulation. I think that the Renewable Energies Directive regulates biofuels in a sufficient manner, and that is why I don't think that we should talk about them when we talk about e-fuels, because their amount is limited. I see. Thank you very much. I know that Jens Giesecke has other appointments today, and that is why we would like to say thank you very much for your contribution, and we wish you a lot of success for your further work. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. And before we listen to the representative of Frontier Economics, I would like to mention two questions to Mr. Berger. One question is, you talked of 20% share of e-fuels until 2030. I don't know whether you can answer this, Mr. Berger, but what kind of amount of fuels do we speak when we speak about 20%? And the second question was, is it true? And of course, you are also an expert on engine development. Is it true that e-fuels could really fuel all combustion engines that are available in the market at the moment? Will it work with any engine? Thanks for the question. I already tried to answer one question in the chat. If you stick to the standards for fuels, then it won't be a problem for engines to use e-fuels. If we look back to E5 to E10 fuel components, then we had academic discussions at some points, and some producers thought that they would not support this because of compliance reasons. But of course, you can use E2 with any engine, and we've learned more about that in the past. If we stick to the technological standards, then it should work. We've got the strictest standards in Europe. Maybe in threshold countries and developing countries, this would be a little bit different, but their engines would also be able to drive on e-fuels. There are fuels which contain hazardous materials which can be dangerous to engines, but this is not the fact when we talk about e-fuels. So basically, if we stick to our technological standards in production, and as I've said, we've got the strictest standards in the world, and this should not be a problem. And the second part of this question was, what about distribution? Of course, we could use the infrastructure for distribution available, petrol stations, distributing vehicles, storage facilities, refineries, grids, everything could be used. The other question, 20%. We chose 20% because for us, they are a limitation. Of course, I could have written down 100% and the problem would have been solved, but I don't know the absolute figure, but I think 20% was the limit of what is doable, but what is also realistic. Of course, I could make adjustments and everything would look even better, but then we could say that we should only use e-fuels and not electric vehicles, but I think that would not be the right answer to this question.
Thank you very much. You can ask more questions through the chat and we will try to answer them. Now we continue with our next part on the agenda, and this is certainly the main presentation, the presentation of the crediting system, and also the presentation of a current study that the eFuel Alliance that was drafted by CLEPA and other organizations, where the impact assessment is presented in detail, that doesn't want to have the crediting system, and also explains the argumentation behind it. And we would like to take a closer look. And therefore, I would like to welcome Michael Zeringer from Frontier Economics. He's one of the managers from Frontier Economics, and he's been working there since 2008. So this is a think tank or a consultancy that is very well known in the field of mobility and climate protection. That's why the know-how is in the right place. And Mr. Zeringer, you have the floor. I think the presentation will be in English. Just to
for the kind introduction, I'll share some slides. Give me a second, please. I hope you can now see the slides. So
Yep, looks good.
As Ralph said, this is a presentation mainly on a new study we have prepared for the eFuel Alliance, VDMA, CLIPA, and NGVA. Let me start with just a very brief introduction, some background and the agenda for today's presentation. So you've heard a lot about the existing regulation, which targets fuel suppliers and car manufacturers separately. So on the one side, you have the Renewable Energy Directive, which targets fuel suppliers. On the other hand, you have fleet target regulation, which targets car manufacturers or OEMs. Now, currently the European Commission, as part of the Fit for 5 package, has reviewed the fleet regulation and has prepared an impact assessment in which it proposed to tighten the 2030 targets, as mentioned before, to minus 55% for cars by 2030, and at the same time has rejected the introduction of a crediting system for low carbon fuels, abbreviated LCF. So low carbon fuels are renewable fuels. That's just another term for fuels which are carbon neutral or have lower emissions. We have prepared several studies on that topic. The first one was a study for the German Economic Ministry, BMWI, where we developed a proposal how such an accounting mechanism could be developed to account for the emission reduction by renewable fuels. And this study only looked on the how, not on the why, so not on whether you should introduce it or not. So in a second study for Neste, we focused on the benefits and dived a bit more deeply into how such a system could actually work in practice from the perspective of different stakeholders. And last, the new study, which will be the main focus of today's topic, and that's the critical review of the impact assessment prepared by the European Commission. And all of the 3 studies will be available publicly. The last study will be published today. Now, let's dive into the main arguments the EC brings forward to reject the introduction of a crediting system. And as we'll show in the remainder of the talk, these arguments are unsubstantiated and actually also contradict the feedback from stakeholders in public consultation. The first point the Commission raises is that a crediting system would blur the responsibility of fuel suppliers and car manufacturers. As I'll show in a minute, the proposed system would actually keep the responsibilities separately, and OEMs would still be responsible for achieving fleet targets, while fuel suppliers still have a separate greenhouse gas emission target, but the crediting system would only extend the technology portfolio for OEMs, how to achieve their fleet targets. The second line of argument is that the Commission alleges the crediting system would undermine efficiency and effectiveness of fleet regulation, meaning that it doesn't provide any environmental benefits and it doesn't provide any benefits for manufacturers and consumers. We show in the study that the methodology used in the impact assessment is actually inadequate and cannot capture the benefits from a crediting system, and therefore also cannot provide a robust basis for such a decision. As I'll show in a minute, a crediting system is actually a valuable low carbon option. It provides environmental benefits as it acts as an insurance to achieve sector targets. It's also a step towards a more holistic and resilient climate policy. And it can only reduce compliance costs for manufacturers as it's a voluntary system and only benefit consumers. These benefits are also reflected in the strong support for a crediting system in the EC's public consultation. Unfortunately, the EC hasn't really used this feedback in forming an opinion on whether to introduce such a system or not. The third point is on cost. So the Commission alleges that the introducing a crediting system would actually increase the administrative burden and the complexity of the regulation. And we find that this claim is unsubstantiated, as the additional administrative costs are limited. The system we propose is built on a pre-existing compliance and monitoring process already in place as part of the RED regulation of fuel suppliers. And the Commission even proposes to introduce a union database for renewable fuels, which would further streamline the process. But also without this union database, the proposed crediting system would work well. Now I'll use the remainder of the talk to dive a bit deeper into each of these arguments. So first, on the alleged blurred responsibility, the proposed system links existing regulation for fuel suppliers and OEMs. So on the one hand, you have the extensive regulation of fuel suppliers in the Renewable Energy Directive, and which sets a quota of renewable fuels or low carbon fuels for fuel suppliers as a ratio of their fuel supplies in the market. It also contains lots of provisions on CO2 saving factors for different renewable fuels, and it also contains provisions on the fossil fuel comparator, so we can rely on this regulation to develop the crediting system. On the other hand, we have the fleet target regulation. That's the regulation under review at the moment. And currently, the regulation only provides two options to meet fleet targets. The first one is fuel efficiency, but that's hard to achieve since internal combustion engines are already a very mature technology. And the second option is to sell more electric vehicles. And in the fleet regulation, electric vehicles are treated as zero emission vehicles, but that's only because we're looking at tailpipe emissions. As we'll show in a second, if you look at the full life cycle of a vehicle, no vehicle technology is really zero emission. So that's only here because we focus on tailpipe. Now, the crediting system would link these two areas, which are already in place, and incentivize fuel suppliers to provide additional volumes of low carbon fuels to consumers. And as these additional volumes have to be financed somehow, since renewable fuels are still more expensive to produce than fossil fuels, OEMs would need to finance these additional volumes and get credits in return. And these credits would reflect the additional emission savings from low carbon fuels brought onto the market. And as they are only generated once they are consumed by mobility users, there is an effective and guaranteed emission saving behind that. Now, OEMs can use these credits and the respective emission savings to count that against their fleet targets, helping them to achieve tighter fleet targets in the future. So in summary, we have a system which links to an existing regulation, all the sustainability criteria and monitoring processes, which are implemented on a national level, as we are talking about a directive. On the other hand, we are amending existing fleet regulation by another technology option, and the amendments are relatively straightforward. So in our report for BMW, we provide a template how to calculate emission savings, and also the legal amendments which would be necessary, which are limited. And there's only a single new parameter needed to introduce a crediting system, and that's the lifetime mileage. So in summary, the crediting system doesn't blur responsibilities, but keeps them separate and ensures that there's no double counting. Now, getting to the benefit side. So which benefits does it provide? And we looked at the methodology used in the impact assessment, and we conclude that it's inadequate to capture the benefits from crediting. The benchmark for the methodology is the guidelines for impact assessments done by the European Commission. And we find that first, it uses the wrong benchmark or counterfactual. And an appropriate benchmark would ask the question, what could happen without a crediting system? And then you look at the system with a crediting system, and if the difference is on balance positive, you would introduce it, and otherwise not. But the impact assessment only considers a single counterfactual, and that's achieving any target level through battery electric vehicles, ignoring other technologies, so plug-in hybrids, fuel cell electric vehicles, for example, and also a very important counterfactual, and that's missing fleet targets if you don't have another technology option. And that has happened last year, even if the difference was, if they just fell below the target by a small margin, it's despite extensive subsidy schemes for electric vehicles. So there's a real risk that we might miss tighter fleet targets in the future. The second one is that the analysis used in the impact assessment is overly simplified. So if you have a robust analysis, you need to consider the specific case and use sensitivities for the main parameters or main assumptions. But the impact assessment ignores important features like the heterogeneity, and we've heard from Martin Berger, the different use cases for different vehicle types, the uncertainty about future market developments. We're talking about benefits which are assessed in 2030, 2035, and the dynamic changes in the market over time. You've just seen how rapid the ramp up of electric vehicles has been over the last year. This is something which shows how dynamic the market can be for new vehicles. So in summary, this methodology cannot provide a robust basis for an informed policy decision. And give me a couple of minutes to explain a bit deeper what we mean by that. So first, the impact assessment does not consider uncertainty apart from fuel costs. But if you look at scientific studies, you see that there's a wide range of future battery costs. And all the studies agree that there will be most likely a cost reduction, but you don't know by how much. And this has to be considered in an impact assessment as well. The fleet composition itself, so in which share will be made up by battery electric vehicles and internal combustion engines over time is highly uncertain as well. Here an example comparing two simulations from different impact assessments provided by the EC, and the shares differ quite significantly. The impact assessment also considers only a single unspecified vehicle in 2030 or 2035. But if you look at reality, you see that there's a broad range of vehicle types and of course a broad range of use cases, people driving long distances, short distances, frequently, less frequently. So that's not captured at all. And last, benefits can occur much earlier than in 2030 or 2035. And for the impact on the climate, it also matters how you get there. So just looking at years in the future and assessing the emissions in that specific year doesn't actually capture the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, which matter. So we're talking about a budget principle. So we have a certain budget of emissions we can still afford. Now getting to the benefits on the environmental side, the crediting system would be an insurance option to achieve emission targets for the transport sector. And as argued before, there's a real material risk that we might miss these targets. So we have missed them already in 2020, despite temporary provisions which ease target achievement. We don't know how the future vehicle fleet will develop. It will depend on technological developments like battery technologies, and battery costs, and fuel costs as well, fuel cell costs as well. We have to consider consumer preferences and their needs, and also the development of the charging infrastructure for electricity and hydrogen. And it's clear that if we rely on electric vehicles, the penetration of this technology also crucially depends on the energy sector delivering the critical infrastructure. Now, a crediting system would provide an insurance option to achieve these targets, because the fuels are already in the market, and we're talking about a wide range of low carbon fuels. And we have the infrastructure in place, as discussed before. So you can use the filling stations and everything else, even the vehicles. The crediting system prevents double counting. So we have strict additionality. It's not an accounting trick. And we have a real replacement of fossil fuel. So we can actually ensure that there are real emission savings. So we're not talking about an accounting trick where you would claim that this vehicle suddenly is clean, but it's guaranteed because you're replacing fossil fuels, which would be used otherwise. And last but not least, OEMs in our proposal would be required to front load credits, so submit credits equal to the lifetime emissions when a new vehicle is sold, which means you start with a negative emission balance at the start, which gets reduced every year of operation until you reach net zero, which accelerates emission reductions. Looking one step beyond the current regulation, which only considers tailpipe emissions, it becomes apparent that we need credible and effective climate protection policies in the longer run, which requires a more holistic view. So we are focusing on tailpipe emissions. We are ignoring the rest of the life cycle. And if you look at the research provided in the impact assessment, you actually find that internal combustion engine vehicles with crediting would provide emission reductions compared to battery electric vehicles. That's the picture from the impact assessment provided by the Commission. And these are lifetime emissions by different technologies. On the left-hand side, you see internal combustion engines. On the right-hand side, the battery electric vehicles for different countries with different mix of the power generation in the respective country. Now, you see that the average, that's the green line, performs much better than the internal combustion engine with gasoline or diesel on the left-hand side. But if you apply crediting and offset the fuel-related emissions, you actually reduce the emissions from internal combustion engine vehicles significantly. And you reach a level which is below, far below the current level of lifetime emissions for battery electric vehicles, and even lower than the 100% renewable fuel electricity mix in the future for battery electric vehicles. So there's a real benefit, and that's coming from the impact assessment directly. Briefly on the benefits for car manufacturers, the Commission claims that compliance costs would be higher using crediting, but that's only because the impact assessment fails to capture the option value of crediting appropriately. So as mentioned before, the impact assessment disregards the possibility of missing fleet targets. And in that case, OEMs would have to pay a significant fine. It also does not consider the policy measures actually proposed by the Commission as part of the Fit for 55 package, which would make low carbon fuels more competitive. And that's the Energy Taxation Directive and an emissions trading scheme for the heat and transport sector, which increases costs of fossil fuels and therefore make low carbon fuels more competitive. And last but not least, the impact assessment does not actually address uncertainty of battery costs. There are lots of studies out there, but no one can credibly and with 100% certainty say how high the battery costs will be in 2030 or 2035. Now, looking at the calculation in the impact assessment, and that's a summary of the calculation presented there, where battery electric vehicles are much cheaper than low carbon fuels in terms of abatement costs to achieve fleet targets. If you correct that for the uncertainty of battery costs, which are still very low, even after applying an uplift by 50%, and after considering the policy measures which would reduce the costs for low carbon fuels, And also looking at the significant fines you have to pay if you miss fleet targets, you quickly find that low carbon fuel crediting is always cheaper than paying the penalty, meaning missing your fleet targets. But it can also be cheaper or more expensive than battery electric vehicles. And I'm not claiming that I know which is the most cost efficient technology in 2030 or 2035. But what I do claim is that no one really knows. And that's why we need flexible and open policies. Now, looking at the benefits for consumers, consumers can choose the best option in that system, which would actually best suit their needs and preferences and offer the best price. So there's no need to calculate the total cost of ownership, as I'll show you in a second. We can leave it to consumers to decide what's the best green mobility option for them. The regulation has to ensure that the standards for green mobility are met, but not which technologies are chosen. And it therefore can only benefit consumers if they have a broader range of choices they can pick from. Now, let's briefly look at the calculation presented in the impact assessment. That's the chart on the right-hand side. It's a simple total cost of ownership calculation for a single unspecified vehicle in 2030. And we believe that this result is flawed for several reasons. First of all, the inadequate methodology. So we're looking at an average vehicle, while in reality, we have a wide range of heterogeneous use cases and vehicles. For some, it might be beneficial, for some not. The average is not really telling you anything. And the result is largely driven by the dark blue bars, which are the compliance costs for low carbon fuels. And as I've shown you on the previous slide, they are largely overestimated in the impact assessment. Last but not least, we're talking here about 2030 and 2035, but we still have 9 years to go until then. And currently, other low carbon technologies are still significantly more expensive than they might be in 2030. And it's feasible to introduce a crediting system short term. So why wait until 2030 when you can now replace or use affordable low carbon technologies such as crediting? The benefits are also reflected in the stakeholder support in the public consultation conducted by the EC. It's just a brief summary, a graph of the results. The green bars indicate the strong support and light green bars, the weaker support. You see there's a clear majority across all categories of stakeholders. And asked about the impact of an accounting mechanism, 75% of respondents agreed that it would lead to more renewable and low carbon fuels, and 68% said it would ensure a more holistic approach to road transport decarbonization. So there's a clear and strong support for such a system, which was disregarded in the impact assessment, at least in the conclusion by the Commission. Last, the argument on high complexity and high administrative costs, which are unfounded. It's actually just half a page in the impact assessment, so not providing any evidence. By design, the crediting system would rely on the pre-existing compliance system, which would, first of all, minimize administrative costs because this is already in place. It's already working. It also ensures strict additionality because using a single system to ensure compliance prevents double counting. And it also would apply the caps from the Renewable Energy Directive on certain biofuels from food and feed crops. Secondly, the necessary compliance checks are straightforward. So these checks are already done for fuel suppliers and would just be amended for car manufacturers. And we have also provided the necessary mathematical formulas for the Commission to check the underlying emission savings. And the Commission itself has proposed a further strengthening of the role of the Union database, emphasizing actually in the impact assessment on that part that it would only generate limited administrative burden for member states. So that seems like a contradiction. The timing of reporting can be aligned with minimal effort. Already today, the amounts of renewable fuels brought onto the market by fuel suppliers are reported intra-year and entered into national databases, and the timing is largely already compatible or can be aligned with minimal effort. So to briefly conclude, the crediting system for low carbon fuels is a no regret measure because it provides benefits, in particular in suboptimal circumstances when, for example, the charging infrastructure is lagging behind. And it can be introduced at low administrative costs. So that's why we find it's a no regret measure. Secondly, it's a step towards a more holistic climate policy, which is necessary if we want to achieve climate targets credibly and have a real impact on global warming. And we find that the rejection by the EC is actually unfounded. The methodology is inadequate, the benefits are underestimated, and the costs are overestimated. Thank you.
Dankeschön, Michael Zeringer. Für alle, die es noch nicht gesehen haben.
Thank you, Michael Zeringer. If you haven't seen it yet, we published the link to the study in the chat so everybody can download the study. And of course, we are going to publish and disseminate the study further. I follow the chat. It is quite interesting what is going on there. We see a lively discussion in the chat. I would like to ask a more general question to Michael Zeringer before I read out the questions from the chat. I think if we take a closer look at the crediting system, then everyone understands the benefits. However, many automotive producers no longer want that. They are against such a crediting system because they say, for us, we have already decided that we will produce electric vehicles in the future, so we no longer need that. But at the same time, the CO2 regulation is addressing these manufacturers because they have to fulfill the targets. So the question is, why should they support such a crediting system, or what should I answer an automotive producer?
Actually, two reasons I can think of why some car manufacturers don't support the system, which provides, as you said, benefits for the industry.
Also es gibt verschiedene Systeme, die angewandt werden können oder Begründungen. Es gibt Fahrzeughersteller, die denken,
to achieve fleet targets, they might at the same time get tighter fleet targets. I believe it's the other way around. So they will get tighter fleet targets anyway. The question is how tight, whether it's minus 55% or more or less. So I don't see that link, but that's probably a reason for some OEMs not to support it. The second reason might be a simple one, and that's raising your rival's costs. So if you think you're a front runner in electric mobility, then obviously you don't want your competitors to have other options, other low carbon options, because it would help them to strengthen their market position. So that could be a reason as well.
Okay, danke. Dann haben wir hier Gerd de Kock.
Okay, thank you. We have Gerd de Kock from Transport and Environment, and I would like to share the question. He refers to a study from Transport and Environment that focuses on the economic aspects and also doubts it. And the study is about, or what is questioned is that a system can not be very cannot show an economic benefit for OEMs, but also for consumers. And this is presented in a specific study. So I assume that, Michael, you know this study. Maybe you can say a few words about this and also tell us what you discussed here in this context.
By Jens Giesecke in his presentation, that we traditionally have relied on market economies to determine technology mix and allocations. And I believe that's still the best mechanism we have. So why would we have to write several studies which make certain assumptions and try and project the future developments until 2030, 2035? If we can come up with policies which are flexible and allow decentral decision making by individual car manufacturers and consumers. So it's simply not possible to determine the optimal technology mix in 2030 or 2035. I can't do it, and I strongly believe others can't do it either. So instead of relying on individual studies that pretend to come up with the optimal answer, we need to set up a system which considers consumer preferences and allows decentral decision making, because that's the only way forward to ensure that we have effective and efficient climate policies.
Okay, danke. Dann habe ich hier im Chat eine ganze Menge Fragen.
Okay, thank you very much. I have several questions in the chat about biofuels. Therefore, I would like to ask you, in the crediting system, to which extent are biofuels included, if at all?
So we propose to actually consider all renewable fuels which comply with the Renewable Energy Directive. So as argued before, we link the Renewable Energy Directive with the fleet regulation. So any fuel which meets the sustainability criteria in the Renewable Energy Directive should be eligible for also being used in this crediting system. That includes a wide range of biofuels and as well as synthetic fuels.
Klare Antwort, Dankeschön. Und dann möchte ich noch mal etwas grundsätzlichere Frage.
So this was a very clear answer. Thank you very much. And I would also like to ask a very fundamental question. This is also an essential argument that is used, and it's also something that I read in the chat, the argument about efficiency. So it is without a doubt that for the production of e-fuels, we do need energy, and the efficiency, or to put it differently, the direct energy use in an e-car is more efficient than transforming it to hydrogen and then from hydrogen to fuel. And therefore, I would like to ask a very fundamental question. What can we do with this efficiency argument, and what is your answer? Because, I mean, we definitely need e-fuels. And what would you say?
So my response, even if that's not the main topic of this study, is twofold. The first part would be on availability of green energy, and I think it has been mentioned by Martin Berger as well. So we have lots of relatively cheap green electricity available in other parts of the world, and unfortunately we can't transport electricity directly. So we need some form of energy carrier, and e-fuels are one way to transport renewable energy from these other parts. And if you look at the full load hours for different renewables, they are far ahead of the full load hours we can reach in Germany or Europe. Take a Patagonia and wind, for example. You can easily achieve 6,000 hours for a wind turbine, while in Germany, you might be lucky if you have more than 2,000 hours. And that makes a huge difference. The second answer would be, if you design policies well, it shouldn't matter that we discuss technical efficiencies, because in market economies, scarce goods have a price, and that is, for example, electricity. if electricity is very scarce and too valuable to be wasted for e-fuels, then e-fuels would be too expensive. No one would buy them. So biofuels would be more competitive. So why worry about kind of writing studies pro and against e-fuels when you can just set up an open system and let consumers and suppliers determine the optimal mix. We can't do it with a single study or a simple model. It's just not feasible. The reality is far too complex.
Ja, danke schön.
Thank you very much. So this was a very nice argument for market economy. Thank you very much, Michael Zeringer, for your presentation and also for the study. I think this is a good foundation for our discussions, and I think we will also discuss it with the Commission in shortly. And of course, we will keep in touch because this topic, it's what also Jens Giesecke told us. This is something that we will deal with for a while. Thank you very much. Now, we would like to listen to two very short statements. At the beginning, we said that the study was conducted via the eFuel Alliance, but not only, it was also with the VDMA, also CLEPA, the European Association of Automotive Supplies, and also NGBA. And we have two representatives who are here with us, and I would like to ask Sigrid de Vries and welcome her. She is from CLEPA, the Association of Automotive Supplies, and we always like to welcome her. She is not here for the first time. Many greetings to you to Brussels. Sigrid de Vries is a journalist and has a lot of know-how in terms of the Berlin politics and also Brussels politics. And before she worked for CLEPA, she worked for the European Association of the of OEMs, and since 2017 she is the Secretary General of CLEPA. A very warm welcome, Sigrid. Thank you very much, Ralf.
Give everybody a bit of time to get used to it, but schön, dass ich hier sein kann. Very happy to be here and also give our views a bit on the whole situation. Indeed, talking from the vantage point of the over 3,000 companies supplying state-of-the-art components and innovative technologies for safe, smart, and of course also sustainable mobility. And our members directly employ about 1.7 million people across the continent on top of the 1.2 million in vehicle manufacturing. So clearly a lot at stake. Of course, suppliers support very much the Paris Agreement and also the EU carbon neutrality objectives by 2050. And we are ready to contribute to a reliable, technology open and also ambitious regulatory framework to achieve these goals. And we believe that the Fit for 55 package contains useful proposals. For example, taking steps to establishing a carbon price in the emission trading scheme and also in the energy taxation directive. We do emphasize also very much the need for charging and refueling infrastructure. And we agree therefore also with the Commission's proposal to mandate targets for member states. But we do also have serious concerns as regards the Fit for 55 package, especially when it comes to the proposed target in the CO2 regulation of 100% emission reduction based on tank-to-wheel emissions, because this is a de facto ban on the internal combustion engine, including on highly electrified hybrids. And yeah, it was already mentioned also by the MEP, Mr. Giesecke. This really fundamentally contradicts the principle of technology openness. It leaves also carbon reduction options unused, and it makes the fast transformation that our sector is in much more difficult to manage. So it's our conviction that all efficient technologies, and that includes plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, but also range extenders and hydrogen combustion, all of that should be allowed to compete on a level playing field, and that means acknowledging the well-to-wheel approach. And therefore, a voluntary crediting system, as we have extensively discussed today, is a workable and it's an achievable way to make a step in the right direction, recognizing emission reduction by using sustainable renewable fuels, including bio and e-fuels, and also as part of a wider mix of measures and steps that can be taken, because of course electromobility will play a crucial role in the future, yet where it is not or not yet the best solution, there should also be choice. And allow me also to address another important dimension of this whole discussion. This is related to our manufacturing footprint in Europe and also our employment footprint. I mentioned already the number of people working in our sector. We are currently finalizing a study on the impact on employment in the automotive supplier industry with the consultancy PwC. And I'm happy to share a first few findings. And I believe they're really important and really compelling, because if the current proposals were to become law, the study finds that about 500,000 jobs would actually become obsolete by 2040. And that's a third of the entire workforce in the suppliers industry, and more than 80% of all internal combustion powertrain jobs. And the bulk of these jobs, about 360,000, would disappear already between 2030 and 2035. So that's a huge transformation to manage in really a very short period of time. It just, illustrates the scale, the magnitude of the transformation, and also the challenge ahead. And this is happening. It's happening anyway. Our study looks at rapid electrification and the impact of that, but looks also at different scenarios that can be applied. And yeah, just to name the current other challenges that our industry is facing, from semiconductor shortages and supply chain issues. I mean, it's really increasingly difficult to operate in this environment. Of course, there will be new opportunities in the EV powertrain also, but the jobs there will not compensate for all the lost jobs. It's likely to be less than half, and they also may be created elsewhere by different companies, and they may require very different skill sets. So they concern different people. Again, the livelihood dimension here, I think, is very, very important. So this transition is, of course, a challenge for the entire industry, but suppliers, unlike vehicle manufacturers, cannot so easily insource or divest. And specifically, the large group of highly specialized SMEs that are facing a significant risk of going out of business should be taken into account. So it's a real concern that we have, that automotive suppliers will be left behind in the transition. And we do have an alternative. The study that we've done shows that the pressure on employment is mitigated by adopting a technology open approach. I'll stop here. The policymakers have a difficult task to come with a coherent package of measures. There are strong concerns about affordability, about consumer choice, about the Green Deal delivering a just transition, leaving no one behind, and all of these concerns are very, very valid. So we really encourage all stakeholders to speak up. A hybrid vehicle, just as the battery electric vehicle, is climate neutral if running on a combination of renewable fuels and renewable energy. And the focus should be really put on defossilization of the fuel and energy supply, and not on banning specific technology. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Sigrid de Vries.
Thank you very much, Sigrid de Vries. I think the study that you mentioned on workforce and possible changes in the automotive industry comes at just the right time, because it is a very important topic that has played an astonishingly small role in the debates, which we follow very closely, of course. Of course, we are in a transition. The automotive industry always had to adapt. But what we witness at the moment is regulation driven, particularly when we talk about topics such as today, and politics have a certain responsibility. Thank you very much. We will follow the development with a lot of interest. And now I would like to give the floor to Jens Andersen. He is one of the initiators of the study we've presented. He represents NGVA Europe, that is the Association of Natural Gas and Biogas Vehicles Association. Welcome, Jens. He worked in the automotive industry for a very long time. He's an engineer and for many years worked at Volkswagen. There he dealt with CMG mobility, which in the corporation is a very relevant topic. It was a relevant topic. And I think we may say that today that it still is. There are still vehicles produced by Volkswagen belonging to that group. We're looking forward to your statement. Yeah, thank you, Ralph. Thank you for giving me the opportunity for a short statement. Everything has been said, but not by everybody, but I don't want to repeat what was said already. I just want to add some things. I found the comments of Sigrid de Vries absolutely right, and I support them. Why did we support this topic? I would like to remind you that the first synthetic fuel that was produced were methane molecules, and they were introduced by the Audi some years ago, somewhere in the north of Germany, and CO2 is being filtered by a biogas plant, and that was the first e-fuel developed by Audi. Until today, I feel very sympathetic for that kind of fuel and supported it, because we have to see that when the crediting system will be introduced, then it will also play a role for the methane molecule. And I would like to point out again that the longer we wait with the implementation of such topics and use older technologies, the longer fossil diesel will be used, which is something that none of us wants. And that is why the use of a crediting system is very important. I just mentioned Audi e-gas, and biomethane was also mentioned briefly. Sometimes I get the feeling that probably Galileo Galilei felt the same way when he was invited to the Pope when it came to the worldview of Copernicus, that the Earth rotates around the sun and not the other way around. Of course, we are talking about biological fuels, which have a large share. And we think that fossil fuel can be replaced by biologically produced methane. I think that we could increase the output tenfold with the plants that we already have in Europe. They could fuel millions of vehicles all over Europe, but the heavy-duty vehicles also have to be decarbonized. And when we talk about ranges of several thousand kilometers, I don't see any technological alternative to biologically produced methane liquefied as biofuel in order to fuel heavy-duty vehicles. And that is why our member associations producing lorries support this approach. It is logical that those who don't support it find arguments against it, but it is a fact, and many studies proved it, that the use of this fuel is really making sense. And I'd like to point to the low carbon fuel standard of California, which was introduced already in 2007 on the basis of scientific findings. So I can't understand why these findings are being questioned. Another point I would like to make, infrastructure, and this is also my signal to politics. Here, there's still a lot to do. in order to supply Europe with LNG or CNG stations. The stations we have still do not fulfill our own wish, and they are not available all over Europe. And I would like that from the Baltic states to Portugal, it's possible to drive a bio LNG driven lorry. But so far, this is not possible because particularly Eastern Europe does not have enough charging stations for alternative fuels. So the only thing you can use there is regular diesel. And I don't understand why Eastern Europe still does not support the further implementation of these fuel stations. We haven't reached our targets yet. And the third point I would like to make, why I think the crediting system is really making sense, and that is the fact that we need responsible opportunities to reduce CO2 emissions, because the factor time plays an extremely big role. We can't live with solutions that will be available only in 15 years, because in 15 years temperatures will have risen by 5 degrees probably. And the rise of new investments, of new technologies, the ramp up curve cannot be increased just as high as we want. We've got technologies available in Europe. We are market leaders, global market leaders with our technologies, and we should use these technologies to reach our targets as long as it is making sense, and also in terms of economics. And that is my final statement. So we should definitely continue to develop things further, which were already supported by scientific findings. We should continue developing such systems, because we've already known for 20 years that these things are making sense. So thank you very much on behalf of NGBA Europe, and I pass the floor back to Ralf. Thank you, Jens. We are looking forward to our further cooperation, and particular in the Brussels legislation processes. We've come to the end of our webinar. We are a little bit out of our timetable, but I think that this is no greater problem. I would like to express my gratitude to all of you. I would like to pass the floor to Tobias Bloch, our head of strategy and innovation, for a short last statement.
Thanks a lot to everyone who has participated today in this great event. I will make it short. What we have seen today is that the impact assessment of the Commission is just simply wrong. The Commission say a crediting system would undermine the effectiveness of the regulation, but it is a voluntary system. If something is voluntary, nobody would choose it if it undermines anything. If an electric vehicle is always the better decision or option for the customer, then it will be chosen. Nobody has to fear that a crediting system would lead to disadvantages, because it is voluntary in the end. In addition, the Commission claims that the administrative burden would be increased, but as Frontier Economics shows, the crediting system rely on existing processes and institutes which are already established for the fuel industry. Therefore, we don't need further administrative burden. In addition, the Commission just built up a union database for renewable fuels. Therefore, it will be solved. And third, the Commission say we would blur the responsibility. But the fuel industry will stay responsible to fulfill the Renewable Energy Directive, and the automotive industry has to fulfill the CO2 emission standards. It is the crediting system is part of the CO2 emission standards. Therefore, the responsibility is at the automotive industry. But we enable to build political bridges between regulation. Because if we want to have a more holistic life cycle assessment in the end, then we need to find solutions to activate all options along the value chain. So if it is cheaper to bring in more renewable fuels to achieve climate goals, or if it is cheaper in future also to use green steel, for example, why don't we use those options? And that's lead us to the conclusion that the impact assessment is maybe more based on ideological reason and not rational. The Commission don't want the internal combustion engine to have its future with renewable fuels. And for that reason, it says all electric only. And we think this is wrong. We think the customers won't accept it. And in the end, it is the wrong way which is chosen. And we really hope that the Parliament and the Council will make the right decision. And we are looking forward to the further discussion. Thanks a lot to everyone, and have a nice afternoon.